Okay, so we're talking about immigration, and we've got a lot of material to cover. I realized I'm not sure I spiced up the material particularly well this time, but then again, there's a ton of things I wish I had done for this material and for making everything entertaining and also a good learning environment at the same time. But we all have to work within the constraints we have. We all have budget constraints, whether they're time or money. One thing I wanted to highlight here, looking at the second page here of announcements. So I changed the announcements page because of my mistakes prior to conferring with the GSIs. And so my apologies if this has become confusing. So the version I have, I think the PDF online might be up to date, and it's 1159. Mine currently states 1243 because I'm just doing the PowerPoint rather than the PDF, and I think I've got the same thing showing here. And that just has to do with the timing of when the labs and the optional sections are. So I apologize if you saw in an earlier version, I got this bullet wrong. The Friday and Monday is coming up this week. That'll be Andrea's optional sections on immigration. We will stay on course then with Lab 11 being due next Friday. Lab 10, which is assortative mating, looking at same-sex couples in the American Community Survey, is due this Friday. Lab 11 is after that. Are there any questions about that before I talk about Lab 13? Again, my apologies for having made that more difficult. That's the plan, and I'll try really hard not to mess with the calendar again and mess it all up. Lab 13 will be a B Courses quiz rather than an RStudio lab. And so we're going to roll that out at some point. It'll be due on Friday the 1st. And one of the main objectives there is to make sure that we are able to field a B Courses quiz that works. If any of you have tips about having seen B Courses quizzes in other classes that you'd like to, say, request a particular format, for example, whether you can see all of the questions at once, or seeing all questions on separate pages. That's one of the big questions we have as designers of this thing. So if you have tips about how you like to see those things formatted, please do go ahead and let us know. We'll be watching Piazza. You can email me if you like. The plan then for the final exam will be that it will be an online B Courses quiz that you can start at a time that is convenient for you. If you're, for example, on the other side of the earth, and like I imagine it's about 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. in China right now, or thereabouts. And that will be the final exam, which we will field and have more details about later. Any questions about the scheduling, the optional sections, the labs, the final exam? I think I'm doing okay, but you're now seeing me pretty much back in my hair length when we started the term. Then I got one haircut this semester, and we hopefully will finish instruction without me looking like an abominable snowman or something. I'm sure many of you are struggling with that as well, now that we suddenly cannot actually pay anybody else to cut our hair. So we've got to figure out some way of getting by. It's a wild time, isn't it? Okay, so onto the course material. We're going to cover the economics of immigration, and today we'll start off with a static model, which you can think of as being a labor demand curve. There also will be a labor supply curve, and the challenge there is if you've seen supply and demand, we will assume that the labor supply curve is perfectly inelastic, so it's upward sloping. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say upward sloping. It just goes up and down. It's vertical. There is no slope to it, and that's a little bit strange if you're not accustomed to it. We'll talk about some empirical evidence supporting or not supporting the simple model of the simple static model of labor demand. We'll move on to the two-country model of immigration, the reading by Michael Clemens, and the solo model if we get to them. Next time we will finish up the material we didn't get to today, and we'll start the fiscal impacts. My apologies for not having updated the course calendar. I think it says fiscal impacts for today, but we'll have those prepared to discuss more next time. I realized that since I had taught the class last time, we had completed the 2016 study for the national academies that included looking at the fiscal impacts again, and I actually had not made any slides yet. So I've been in touch with Gretchen Donahauer, who was also a consultant to that panel and has some slides. So it's a matter of getting them into the pipeline and ready for public consumption. So first then, we'll talk about the static macroeconomic model of immigration. So it's macroeconomic in the sense that we're talking about the entire economy. It's maybe not traditionally macroeconomic in the sense that there will not be feedbacks. There are feedbacks in the solo model where capital can adjust. Here, this is a static model, so it's a model of the aggregate economy, but there is no adjustment. There's immigration that happens, and then things don't yet adjust, and we will see what happens in terms of winners and losers with immigration. The quote here is a real title of a paper by the great George Borjas. So George is a fantastic economist and a really pleasant fellow, and he also has really strong opinions about things. And so he actually titled this paper in part, "The Labor Demand Curve is Downward Sloping," with, I think, italics in the actual title. Now, on the one hand, one might say this is not a controversial perspective. Well, of course, a demand curve slopes downward. Okay, but as you'll see, that if you assume that is true, and if it always slopes downward, and if there is no adjustment of, say, a shifting of the demand curve, then you're left with a rather dismal view of what immigration will bring. It's not unlike what happens in the Malthusian model if there isn't any change in technology or productivity or science or something that shifts the labor demand curve there. So it's somewhat of a bleak perspective, and it's one that he has had and expounded upon for some time. I think one of the more interesting papers that he's written over the last 2 decades since this one, roughly, was about the fall of the Iron Curtain and the immigration of Russian mathematicians. What was interesting about that was that with the Soviet Empire and this sort of partitioning, if you like, of the East versus the West and clash of civilizations in some sense, what had happened was a completely different set of mathematical science perspectives was occurring in the former Soviet Union compared to the West. And so the specializations within math were different in the East and the West. With the collapse of the Iron Curtain, suddenly restrictions on the movement of these scientists were lifted. And thus they brought new ideas into math. They offered a unique product. What Borjas did was look at what occurred to the market for mathematics PhDs in this country as a result of importing or immigrating Russian mathematicians. And the answer fits this story that he likes to point out, that the labor demand curve is downward sloping, especially in the case of university scientists or tenure track professors. You know, those sorts of things don't obviously adapt well to changing conditions, or if they do, they might not adapt in the way you might think they would. And so what turned out then that happened in the market basically for advanced PhD mathematicians is that native-born mathematicians lost. They suffered in terms of employment. I'm not sure whether you looked at wages. And that's kind of a specialized example, but it gives you a sense of the perspective that Borjas likes to bring to the table, which is that, look, if you open a border to the flow of labor, you might well find that labor competes and there are going to be winners and losers. I guess that's a way of summarizing what we'll look at here. So in the macro model, we're not talking about mathematicians. We're talking, broadly speaking, about these big groups of skilled labor, people like you, like me, people with college degrees, people who combine with unskilled labor, so natives without a high school education, which at the time of the writing of the 1997 report was the number like 20%, which seems rather high. It is, as we'll see later. So currently the percent of the labor force that does not have a high school education is more like 8 or 10%. So it's lower, and it's because we are now 20 years later. So many of the birth cohorts have aged out and retired, the ones that didn't have a lot of education. So that'll be one part of the model here, that unskilled labor is going to be natives without a high school education. It'll be immigrants, and it's not always true that they don't have a high school education But it's also the case that a large share of immigrant labor is fairly low skill and does not have a lot of education. Um, that's one part of the story. We'll also talk about the other part, which is that a lot of immigrants have, PhDs, for example, or medical degrees, things like that. So think of skilled labor and capital as being the same for our purposes here, because we're not going to have like 3 different graphs. We're just going to have one, and assume that those are in fixed supply. And of course, that's an assumption that gets relaxed in the extreme when we look at the solo model, because capital can adjust. You could think about skilled labor potentially adjusting also if you believe that natives could go to college and to choose to do that because they view the returns to less than a high school degree, or even just a high school degree, as having fallen, or something like that, as provided they have access to the financing to do it. There's no unemployment. We've got perfectly vertical labor supply curves, and so you get full employment, no choosing not to work. And of course, that's one of the big questions in real economics. But for now, we're going to keep things more simple than that. We'll assume there's no international trade. There are ways to think about this where trade and immigration might be sort of substitutes. The labor could stay in its home country and produce goods and then trade in improving its standard of living in that way. I guess it's a good question as to why that doesn't happen, but of course, I guess all you have to do is open up the newspaper to realize that the thing about international trade is that there are taxes on the flow of goods and services across borders called tariffs. And there are other things that make trading, especially things like services, rather difficult. It's obviously not possible to have say a Canadian or a Mexican person do your taxes for you. I mean, I guess in theory you could, but there are reasons to think that would be a pretty bad idea. We'll have constant returns to scale, which means that if factors increase together, then the prices of those things remain ultimately unchanged. And so that will be important later. The key insight here in thinking about the division of total output across factors is that you can see total output in a labor demand diagram as the area under the curve. So the math would look something like this. It turns out this is called the fundamental theorem of calculus, like I guess all of us have in our backs of our heads from whenever it was, freshman year, or maybe in high school if you've seen it the first time. But it's the integral or the area under the curve from the origin out to however much labor you've got of this. This is the marginal product of labor, the partial of total output with respect to L. The additional twist then is that total product is split across the factors of production. And here you don't have to assume that that you've got Cobb-Douglas production, so you've got a constant share going to the factors, but you can also assume that if you want. It doesn't really matter what detail you go into with that. The nice thing is that we'll see that the returns to labor equal the wage times the amount of labor, which is a rectangle with height W. So that's because we're looking at a labor demand curve here. So we've got the wage here along the vertical axis. We've got the labor along the horizontal. And then the wage given by that is the height, and the base is the amount of labor. Capital earns what's left over, which is a triangle. So here we are, and this probably looks familiar to you, a downward sloping labor demand curve. Before immigrants arrive, we've got L0 unskilled workers earning wage W0, and so their total earnings is this rectangle A, the area of which is given again by the product of the wage, which is the height times the base, or the width there, which is L0. Skilled labor and capital get the other part of this, which is the other part of the area under the labor demand curve that is not this rectangle. So it's the triangle up here. And it's also true, and you'll see in Michael Clemens's reading, for example, that the labor demand curve might be curved, literally a curve rather than a straight line here, and that's fine. The main point is that there's a prevailing wage, and that's giving you this nice horizontal cleaving, if you like, between areas A and B. That's really the critical thing. It doesn't matter a ton what the shape of the labor demand curve is, as long as the thing is downward sloping. Total GDP then is the sum of A plus B. And then the learning objective here is to be able to step through what happens if there's more unskilled labor that arrives in the form of immigration. So there are going to be losers and winners. Suppose that M immigrants arrive, and so we're going to just step that out here where this is effectively a labor supply curve, if you like, that's a perfectly vertical thing. And if we've got M immigrants, then moving us from L0 to L1 is this distance M. The wage will fall because the labor demand curve slopes down. That's always true about demand curves, except very special ones that might be, say, perfectly flat. So perfectly elastic demand curves exist. In normal times, that might be a good way of describing, say, the demand for agricultural goods that a small farmer might see. It's like a perfectly elastic demand curve. If you raise your price, you're going to not get anybody showing up at your door to buy corn or whatever it might be. So the wage falls if immigration produces more unskilled labor in the labor market. Then you could think about the amount that is earned by immigrants as being this rectangle C down here. That's the product of the number of immigrants M times the wage, this new wage that they earn. Of course, it's the post-immigration wage, so it's W1. And we'll talk later about how this should be a net gain for them relative to what it had been. Now, if immigrants are political refugees, it might not necessarily be a gain compared to what they perhaps had been earning before fleeing the country. And there are reasons to think that immigrants, generally compared to natives anyway, probably suffer somewhat of a wage penalty, which really we have not depicted here in this graph. We're just keeping this simple. You want to think about unskilled labor as being people without a high school degree, and language skills are not important. Maybe it's something like, taking hay bales and stacking them on a farm or something like that. You don't really need to have a ton of skills to be able to do that. The thing is that in many cases, immigrants arrive with language abilities that are not quite the same as those of natives, and certainly cultures and customs tend to be rather different. So for more complicated economic tasks, you would expect generally that especially a new immigrant might be less productive. Here we're abstracting from that. We're imagining a world in which, maybe we're solely talking about agricultural employees, which is not a bad model to have in mind for some of them. As we'll see, of course, it's a dramatic oversimplification compared to the real picture of US immigration and world immigration more generally. So let's think about what has happened to GDP then when this occurs. So we've got losses then by native unskilled workers and gains for native skilled workers and capital. There's some redistribution here. That's part of maybe the problem. I mean, is this really understood well by the political forces within a country that this is basically a redistribution? I'm not sure that that's obvious. I think perhaps less skilled labor views their losses as real, but perhaps they're not maybe seeing this more subtle point that this rectangle R gets ripped away from the labor in this diagram and given to the other factors of production. And why? Well, it's because adding more unskilled labor makes those factors more productive and diminishes the productivity of unskilled workers because there are more of them. But the other factors which are in fixed supply right now benefit from this. So you could think about this as being a sort of a political economy theory of which forces within a country or which groups might be pro-immigrant or anti-immigrant, at least in theory. Now, of course, the weird thing, and this may be somewhat in flux, but if you were to think traditionally about which are the political factors that are represented here, say, or vice versa, by skilled labor and capital. And I think you would traditionally have said the US Republican Party. Now this may be somewhat in flux, but then you might wonder, well, why in the world then would be the Republican Party of today, would it be rather anti-immigrant, it would appear? Yeah, we've come to the mind-bending world of everything that we've fallen into since 2016. This is kind of a good question, but you could also then turn this a bit on its head and wonder about the trends in the Democratic Party, which have also been toward higher educated workers. And the reason they're called blue cities, of course, on the coasts is because of they're leaning toward the Democratic Party and its politics. And increasingly, those politics are one of more open borders and more sympathy, empathy, and support for immigrant labor and immigrant families. A bit of a sea change. With immigration, then, native capital and skilled workers gain. And that's part of the reason why they might be politically in favor of immigration of unskilled labor. Now, if we were to turn this on its head and say, let's turn back the clock here and do this all over again, but instead of having unskilled labor increased by immigration, suppose it was skilled labor, well, then the story would be completely upended. And you might find then that unskilled labor would actually benefit by the arrival, say, of more doctors, more PhD sociologists, and more lawyers and groups like that. And the groups that compete directly with those individuals then would lose. It all depends on how you set up the question here and what your assumptions are. And I think it is quite plausible that one could imagine a world in which high skill immigration competes with domestic high skill workers and would lower the wages paid to domestically born high skilled workers. It's certainly not beyond the pale. In addition to gaining this area by redistribution, so back to the graph here, we've got there was rectangle R, and there's also this little triangle G. Now that is a net gain to the country as a whole from immigration, but it accrues solely to the other factors of production, not unskilled labor here as shown in this model. They only get this rectangle A, they get C plus A if you count immigrants as being part of this group, and there are reasons to do it or maybe not. So G is a net gain, but the thing about triangles like this in graphs is that they are known to be small and called second order small usually, because they're just a triangle there. And we'll look at how big that triangle probably is for the United States. I think, well, of course, this guy B is also a big triangle as well, but just visually, it's quite a bit larger because we're talking about starting from the origin and moving all the way out here. Triangles are important in redistributions, in deadweight losses. This is not a traditional example of that. It's actually a gain. But in, for example, public finance, thinking about the impact of taxes on economic activity, we usually talk about these deadweight loss triangles as being a real problem. But still, if the tax is small, if immigration is relatively small, the triangle itself is even smaller, and it tends not to be a very big deal. What is a big deal is the redistribution, this rectangle R, that gets yanked away from domestic unskilled labor when immigration happens. So here's our scorecard then. Winners and losers. The native unskilled labor originally started off with A plus R, and they end up with only A here. And I guess I regret the ambiguity here. The trick is to look at this graph. I think when I started off, I called everything that currently is A plus R, I called it A. So I apologize for that. The problem basically is there's a wedge that's shaved off of this big rectangle. We're calling it R here. So it obviously depends on which one of these you're looking at to begin with. Native skilled labor and capital starts off with B, that stays the same, and then they get B plus R plus G. So the new gain here, I think that was the motivation for my calling it G, and R is the redistribution, G is the gain. It's that kind of mnemonic sort of thing that we love to do. Immigrants we don't really know what they had earned beforehand, but it's probably something that is less than what they were earning afterward, which is this area C. And when we shift to the two-country model, in a bit, we will have a little bit more definitive things to say about that. Natives are earning A plus R plus B altogether to begin with, but then afterwards they're actually, in addition, getting this little net gain, G. So G is the net gain to the domestic factors overall. The total change in GDP, I think, is on the next slide, and that's actually also going to include this amount C, which is earned by the immigrants who are in the country. So GDP, meaning the domestic production, that actually includes that as well. So the definitions vary a little bit depending on whether you're talking about native factors or total domestic production, which means everything that's happening within the country. So here's the breakdown there with GDP before and after, and then of course if you wanted to assign it to the native born, if you like, factors, the difference is the presence or not of this rectangle C. So let me pause there and see if there are questions about how we've divvied all this up. Okay. Okay. So I suspect we're in great shape here because probably these things are fairly familiar to all of the econ majors in the class. If they're not familiar, absolutely we can cover them more in detail. So here's a chat question. Is that B more like the extra gain for skilled workers? Area B is the amount that is going to skilled workers and capital initially, before immigration happens, and then after immigration happens, they get B plus R plus G. Does that help? Okay. All right. So you might wonder how big these actually are. Here I've not really drawn these to scale, as we'll see shortly when I start assigning numbers here. And in slide 14, actually, I've written down the percentages which are aiming to give you a sense of the magnitudes. And in fact, this is not at all the scale. So we'll see that here in slide 14 in a second. So how big are these effects? You know, that's the next useful thing. Qualitatively, it's important to see this point that when immigration happens, you're going to see, at least in the short run, gains and losses that depend on whom you're talking about. Factors that compete with the immigrants are going to see reductions in their earnings and their wages. Factors that are complementary with immigrants are going to see improvements. You might think, you know, if that's hard to keep in your head, you might imagine, well, suppose we're thinking about immigrants as being agricultural workers. Who benefits from agricultural workers arriving as immigrants and working? Well, there too, you might realize consumers do, of course, but in the short run, it's probably owners of farms, say owners of vineyards and things like that. It turns out that there's a very large agricultural sector here in California. Maybe that's rather obvious. Perhaps a little bit less obvious is that there's a particularly large one that's just several miles north of us in the wine countries of Napa and Sonoma County. And there is a ton of labor, both native labor, but also immigrant labor at work on those vineyards and wineries usually. One of the big questions, I think, is going to be what will happen during the harvest. Now, luckily, most of the time, harvests tend to be after the hottest time of the year, which is a good thing, given what we think we know about the coronavirus. We will see, though, how all that shakes out. So in the short run, you might imagine, well, farms gain a ton, and they do when they have more labor that they're able to employ. The people who probably suffer in the short run would be people who compete directly with that type of labor that's immigrating. And let me say here too that I've thought about this when teaching this sort of thing. We all compete with foreign labor, and of course that's true also if you are a foreign national and you're returning to your domestic labor market. It's true that some countries don't have a ton of immigrant labor, but most countries have at least some. And of course, here in the United States, also Canada is a high immigration nation. A lot of workers compete with immigrant labor. Another thing you can say, of course, is that, okay, you compete with labor. That's true in a market when you're supplying similar products, or in a labor market when you're trying to get hired, and you bring certain skills to the table and you compete with other workers who have those same skills. That's true. It's also the case, of course, that you can combine with immigrant labor or native labor, whichever one, and be productive. So in my personal career, I think both I have competed with immigrant labor and not gotten some jobs because of immigrant labor. I think that's true. And I've also become more productive by working with immigrant labor. I think that's most definitely true. It's hard to see the counterfactual, of course, if you were to think of, well, what if there had been fewer immigrant PhDs in the labor market for college professors? What might have happened? That's always very hard to understand, but I think it's probably the case that more trained immigrant PhD holders here in the United States means that there will be fewer academic jobs available for native workers. Part of that is because the academic job market doesn't do a particularly good job of responding to labor market conditions, expanding, say, the number of higher education jobs that are available. I think it's the outlook for that is better in the private sector, which is, I think, better at responding to and expanding production when it has access to more labor. But in addition to that, I rather strongly feel that my productivity has been improved because of collaborating with immigrant labor that otherwise wouldn't have been here had we not had an open immigration system like we do. It's not fully open borders, not by a long shot, but we have historically had a good and healthy immigration system, one that has worked for some and perhaps not worked so well for others. All right, back to the macro impacts then, away from the micro impacts that are so much more fun sometimes to talk about. What's the story with the macro impacts? If you think about the magnitudes of these sorts of things, the useful way to do this is to work in percentages, and you need to know the also the slope of the labor demand curve, but the changes in the amount of labor and the shares that we're talking about here. So a 33% increase in unskilled workers, which is what we were talking about in 1997, with this rather extreme thought experiment of, what if you were to just remove all of the unskilled labor, all of the immigrant labor from the country, what would you see? And then compare these two worlds, the world in which we live in, to this counterfactual world, which is a very extreme one. Suppose you have removed everybody. What would you see? Well, you would see a rather large increase of say 10% in the wage paid to unskilled workers. Another way of saying that is that the presence of unskilled immigrants in the country probably decreases the wages of workers with less than a high school degree who are natives by a pretty decent amount. That's, I think, rather, I think it would be hard to dispute that. It's hard to measure it other than by this back of the envelope kind of thing. But then one of the questions might be, well, what is the net benefit of having those unskilled immigrants here in the country? How broadly is it felt? How big is the impact? Well, we can work through it then by doing the math here with the area of a triangle is 1/2 the base times the height. So suppose we're talking about a 33% increase, and so this is the part that's most definitely not to scale here in this graph. So this only looks eyeballing, I think, maybe 1/10 or so of the total amount of labor, and it turns out for natives with less than a high school degree back in 1997, the number was about 33%. Given the estimate of the slope of this, a change of 33% would give you a reduction in the marginal product of labor, or the wage, of about 10%. And so the product of these things times 1/2 then gets you into the territory of something like this, 0.0165. That's the percentage gain for unskilled labor who earn 10% of GDP, which is another step that I think usually confuses students who see this. What we want to do is translate this into a story about national GDP, and what we're seeing here is just part of the story, just the unskilled labor market part. So we're multiplying it then again by another 10%. If GDP is 21 trillion, and I looked it up and hadn't taught macroeconomics in a while, I was a little bit surprised to see that, but at least before coronavirus, $21 trillion is a lot of money. That's the current dollar GDP. And so we're talking about something that might be about $36 billion. And on a per capita basis, that's not particularly large. So that's the net gain in natives GDP. That's this little triangle G. And we're talking about maybe 110 bucks per person. Now, today, obviously, having an extra 110 bucks, not bad. Keep in mind that this fiscal stimulus package is attempting to give something like 1,000 or up to 1,500 plus additional credits for children or something like that to households, which is another order of magnitude bigger than that. So this is not a large number. And the other problem is it's spread across a whole lot of people. And 110 bucks over a typical year is a rather small percentage of income. That's not unlike what you would see in an analysis of free trade or something else spread across an entire economy. The punchline tends to be that openness to migration or trade is good, but the individual feels a very small amount of this good. It's spread across so many different people. Here, of course, the other point to say is that the good is felt by a particular kind of consumer. It's not the unskilled labor who lose. So we might think about adjusting this number a little bit. $110 is so vanishingly small per person. And that's what happens, of course, if you were to actually redistribute the benefit across everybody, in which case then unskilled labor would actually get a little bit of this back, but of course they've already gotten hurt so much. So the aggregate picture is one in which unskilled labor is hurt a ton. Everybody is helped a little bit. In a voting scenario, of course, in a democracy, unskilled labor is a minority, and so it would lose the vote here, but they are hurting much more than all of the winners are benefiting. Let me pause and see if there are questions about this. Okay, so another slide looking at the context. For most, it's a small effect. Average annual increases in GDP are more like 3 or 3.5% growth, and compared to this, about 0.2% is fairly small. It's, yeah, the impact of climate change looks like this, I think, in the medium term. I would have to think about how those things compare. If you thought about a permanent change rather than an annual change, just what happens if everybody gets removed, it's not particularly huge here. Yeah, let me think about that offline about comparing immigration and climate change. $110 then if you split it across 330 million Americans, but a 10% drop in real wages might be something like a 3,000 reduction in an annual salary of 30,000. This is not unlike what we see in analyses across entire economies of international trade. We're talking about exchanging products or factors of production. And the gains typically are diffuse. They are enjoyed a little bit by many, many, many different consumer groups and also producer groups. But there are identifiable and finite groups that often are hurt by competition. And so I guess then we'll get into this issue of political lobbying and how much lobbying power these different groups may have. That's, I think, usually a bigger issue with international trade. But I also think, given what has happened over the last 4 or 5 years with the United Kingdom leaving the European Union in large part because of wanting to leave the system of immigration, to some extent this is changing a bit. Time will tell, I guess. Okay. What have we seen since 1997? And I think I wrote this slide back in the middle of this past decade, so I suspect things may have changed a little bit more from where these statistics place us. But I think the direction of this change compared to 1997 still is absolutely right, that there are fewer native workers who have less than a high school degree because of the expansion of education over the last century, and older birth cohorts have retired. So we're talking about, say, 8% of the 160 million native workers back around 2014, I would imagine, or maybe about 10 million, 9 or 10 million workers have less than a high school degree. By comparison, perhaps 30% of the 20, probably that might be more like 22 million foreign-born workers today have less than a high school degree. And so what we're talking about then is a much larger share of that pool of less skilled workers who are foreign-born. And if you do the math, it turns out that you might see a 20% drop in the wages of native unskilled labor as a result of immigration. Net impact on GDP that's about the same, 0.2% versus rather, I'm sorry, an updated number of 0.3%. So a little bit larger, but a much larger amount of pain borne by native unskilled labor because they are in shorter supply, and some would have would have been much better off if magically you could just remove all of these low-skill immigrants, which of course is a tough scenario to really think about playing out, but that's what the numbers imply. Now the fact is, of course, non-immigrants are low skill, and to get our heads around what the implications of this are, the more of like a bimodal distribution of skills among immigrants, meaning that you've got a bunch of folks who have less than a high school degree and a bunch of folks who are highly trained and who have professional degrees and PhDs and things like that. How would all this analysis change if immigrants had higher skills? Well, I guess it's helpful to say, suppose they had exactly the same skill proportion. That's taking the kind of the other extreme here, and then realizing that the reality is probably the average then of what we're going to see here in the next slide, and compared with what we had just seen, where we had assumed that all immigrants were low skill. So let's step through what happens if we assume that immigrants are exactly the same as natives. The impacts that you would see would basically be nothing, other things equal. If they had the same amount of skills and the same amount of capital, then relocating shouldn't change anything at all, except just what you call people. It's kind of a stretch to imagine that being exactly the case. And I think the reason it's a stretch is that we know immigration and the movement of people across borders is a special thing. It's not this detached, robotic relocation of people. Having neighbors who speak a particular language and who chat with you is obviously part of human life. And we would notice it if things were different. We would notice if there weren't any foreign-born people around, and we would notice it if there were a lot more. Still, in this simple model of production, what matters is the amounts of skills, the capital, the amounts of complementary factors of production that are around. And so if we would imagine having just duplicated the nation of the United States and stitch the two groups together, or even suppose you were to take Canada and the United States and join them together, they have not identical, but very similar labor supplies, labor forces in terms of skills, and similar GDPs per capita. What would you see if you did that? And the answer is probably not much. The real effects would be on social fronts and other things like that. We would not see much in terms of effects on wages. So the next slide then attempts to illustrate what this might look like. Suppose we were to think about the native or domestic labor market here full of natives. And if there was another pretend immigrant country where everything was exactly the same, so the prevailing wage was exactly the same, the sort of altitude, if you like, of the labor demand curve was exactly the same, meaning that people are exactly as productive there. And of course, then you're wondering, well, all right, well, why would you ever leave? Well, there could be something else like what would you say, an earthquake? I guess that might destroy the capital. In this example, immigrants move with all of their skills and their capital all at the same time. They bring it all. It's kind of like, again, stitching together the United States and Canada. What would you see? And it would look something like this. The the shapes would relocate. The amounts that are absorbed and given to these different factors of production would stay exactly the same if we imagine this M amount of labor getting up and moving along with all the other factors of production. So here's the square just shifting up into the domestic economy. And now here's another set of animations showing the triangle moving up over here. And then I split it in half and just imagine that we could just kind of slide it over and suddenly draw a new labor demand curve. So the movement of everything, if you had skilled labor and unskilled labor in the same proportions, would shift out the labor demand curve immediately in a rather obvious way, because you've got more skilled labor to combine with unskilled labor. The wage paid to unskilled labor would stay exactly the same under this hypothetical extreme scenario, and all the returns to the other factors would stay exactly the same. It's only in our differences that there's any benefit to, obviously these huge fixed costs of moving. If you're a college student, you probably think all the time about the amount of cash it takes to move you around the country. I certainly did. You're probably not renting a U-Haul, you're probably going to UPS or FedEx or something like that to ship things. I remember I did that a ton. And every time you do it, obviously you pay this big penalty for moving things. There has to be a reason for you to get up and move, going to college, getting a job, something like that. And here that's the point, right? It's labor relocating from an immigrant country to a receiving country because they're getting jobs and they're earning more than they otherwise would. So the punchlines then are that the gains to immigration arrive when we are different, when natives, that's what we means here, natives and immigrants are different. When immigrants and natives are exactly the same, there aren't any obvious economic gains anyway. But the upside, at least, is that when they are exactly the same, there also isn't any redistribution. There aren't any losers from immigration. One of the big challenges is that when immigrants and natives are different in terms of the quality of labor that they're bringing into the labor market, there are winners and there are losers. And that's the point for the political economy of it all, is that without compensating the losers, those losing groups will probably become much less amenable to immigration laws that allow similar flows to happen. So it's true that there's a lot of similarity between native and immigrant labor, but it's also a fairly realistic thing to model them as being different, and I think that's the useful part of all this. I think it's a bit less useful to do what we just did in the animation, showing much similarity. I think the picture is really more of one in which there are clear differences. Maybe that's sort of an obvious point. People migrate for a reason, and they migrate because there are differences, and so they are producing net gains to themselves when they move. And the challenge, I think, is to notice that, at least in the short run, then there also are impacts on the domestic economy that will not obviously be offset unless there are government policies set up to do that. Let me pause there and see if there are questions before moving on to some of the empirical evidence. Empirical evidence then, whoops, okay. There are a variety of ways that you could do this sort of thing. You could look at small area studies and examine areas that have lots of foreign-born labor and compare them to places that don't have lots of foreign-born labor. And the problem that runs into is that those two places are usually not otherwise the same. There are reasons why immigrants tend to relocate to certain areas. And so if you compare those two types of areas, one with a high level of immigration versus an area with a low level of immigration, you're probably comparing apples and oranges. Many other things then would change the background characteristics of those places. You could look at natural experiments. And so the most famous one there is what's called the Mariel boat lift. And I've got a slide to show later. And you will be working on that in lab 11. Mariel boat lift placed a bunch of Cuban political refugees in Miami, and provided this natural experiment to examine what happened in the Miami labor market. We'll also, in a second, look at the influx of meat processors. It's not a funny thing in your laptop computer. It's the latest from Intel, the meat processor. Meat processors means people who go and pack meat in, I think it's chicken plants was the main industry in this small area study that we're going to look at very, very shortly. Meatpacking is pretty important when you realize too, and if you're like me, you've been thinking a lot about the network of food distribution and production and getting it out to consumers and all, because it's sort of become pretty salient during these times when so much of the rest of the economy has been shuttered. Bottom line is that many of these studies seem to show near zero effects for all kinds of labor, which is a bit surprising considering what we have just seen in the theoretical model. With some evidence that recent immigrants do get hurt. So the idea here to keep in mind is that in our theoretical model we just looked at, the static model, we're comparing domestic labor without a high school degree and calling that unskilled labor. We're comparing those workers to immigrant workers, and we're imagining that those are basically perfect substitutes. And that is maybe somewhat true. There's certainly more substitutability between an immigrant without a high school degree and a native without a high school degree than there would between either of those groups and a native, say, with a college degree. That's true. But one would imagine that a closer substitute to a recent immigrant is a current immigrant. So in other words, a recent past immigrant, somebody who has arrived, say, 5 years ago, especially if you held country of origin the same. If you thought about comparing a Cuban American who arrived 5 years ago to a Cuban American who arrived today on average, so you imagine their average age is comparable, those are probably much more substitutable types of labor. And the evidence suggests that, in fact, yes, it's those people who probably get hurt the most by the presence of new immigrants who are most like them in terms of the characteristics of that labor supply. And so here are some citations from literature that now seems so distant in the past, almost 40 years ago now. This paper by Grossman, a 10% increase in immigrants reduces wages of earlier immigrant waves by 2%. And so David Card, in his study of the Mariel boat lift, finds the same increase reduces earlier immigrant wages by 4%. But the critical thing about the Card study is that one of the most surprising things is the impacts on workers other than earlier Cuban immigrants. Was revealed to be very little effect, if any, which was quite surprising considering what one would usually expect. Here's a table of elasticities, so percentage responses in wages to a change in immigration. And these are all small. Now, the literature, of course, is much broader than this set of papers, I think, that was cited back in the 1997 study, but it's still illustrative, which is why the slide is still in here today. The empirical evidence on immigration is surprising because one would expect, given what we had just stepped through with the theory, that there ought to be some, decently sized effect somewhere. And it appears that really the biggest one, which I don't think is shown particularly well on the slide here, is on the previous waves of immigrants who are most directly substitutable with the current waves. So you want to think about it, if this the Mariel boat lift, the Cuban Americans who had just arrived, say, 5 years previously, that sort of story. Not so much on natives. Here, our next case study is a more recent one. This was just a fantastic thing that I think NPR, what is This American Life? I'm trying to remember which group that is exactly, but I think they commissioned this study. And what they looked at were local area labor markets in Alabama. Alabama, of course, is one of the 50 states. You might wonder why the interest there. It was because at the time, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who had been Attorney General up until something like 2018 or so, was from Alabama and had notoriously been rather anti-immigrant for quite some time and was kind of on this team within the presidential administration to reduce immigration. Well, so This American Life commissioned some people, I think explicitly, to look at that because I thought it would be an interesting case study. The other part of it was that Jeff Sessions himself, who previously had been a senator prior to being Attorney General, often talked about anecdotally what it was like living in Alabama with the influx of the foreign-born. And as you'll see, within some parts of Alabama, there was a very large increase in the foreign-born share of the labor force. The question is, of course, how did that affect anything? Did it? How would you measure it? And what this study does is compare the changes within those small areas over time with changes in other similar small areas over time, which is an approach that is called difference in differences, very commonly used in social science. So Albertville, Alabama, a small town, and it was a meatpacking place. The chickens, I think, that we were talking about on a previous slide. Packing chickens into packages, of course, is something that you don't require a college degree to do. And low-skill whites, non-Hispanic whites, and low-skill immigrants then would be in a similar labor market, competing with one another for a job packing chickens. It just doesn't sound very fun, does it? I mean, it's tough because I just love chicken so much, and chicken's like one of the best things there ever was, right? And I used to hope those chicken packers get plenty of overtime or something, especially these days. When I don't know what would happen if we didn't have access to our chicken. I think we'd all, I mean, there's tuna, of course, right? The other white meat, but man, it still seems kind of bleak. And you might imagine that if life is kind of bleak in your professional sphere, I think that's one of the big things that maybe we don't talk that much about, that we can sit here in Demag Econ C175 and talk about studies that show no impact of immigration on local labor market conditions. And I think it's important to state that. But what's still happening is that people who are chicken packers, and they live in small communities in the United States, and they see changes in their community like this, like a shift from a 98% non-Hispanic white small city in 1980 to 20 years later, 75% or less. So 25% then was Latino or Hispanic. And that's a pretty big change. Leaving aside what happens on the economics of it all, it's different when places change. We here in Berkeley, and of course most of you are probably not Berkeley natives, and probably you may well not be natives in the Bay Area, but I can tell you that even here, those of us who are kind of more locals talk all the time about the way things are changing. It's especially true if one were to live in San Francisco, which some of you probably do. It's quite natural, I think, to see the way things are changing. It's also quite natural, and this is what Paul Romer, of course, famously talked about in his Nobel Prize lecture, and is it sort of obliquely hinting at with his work on the increasing returns to scale of human populations. He talks about the insularity of humankind and the distrust that can easily arise, and trying to fight back against that in some way. Well, so here's our contribution to that. Our contribution meaning the sociologists and economists here. And so these are our two economists who are looking at this thing, and demographers, to try to assess, well, what are the implications of these big changes here? We're not talking about the social changes at all. We're talking about changes in wages and employment. And of course, it may be rather difficult for people, especially who live in these small places, to get their heads around that. It's certainly difficult to get one's head around, comparing what is happening to a counterfactual, what would have happened, say, if immigrants hadn't arrived. And that's what this research is trying to do. What happens in this research? So Giovanni Perry, who's a guy who was in the graduate program about the same time I was, back around the turn of the millennium. He's now at UC Davis. He and a co-author, they look at wages and unemployment in Albertville, and they also look at other similar places within Alabama. And the objective is to look at places like Albertville, where there was a giant increase in the Mexican-American community there, driven by a recession in Mexico and jobs in the United States, and to see comparatively what happened in other counties rather that were otherwise similar. That's always the bugaboo, is to try to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. So ideally, of course, you'd want an Albertville that lived in like the bizarro world alternative dimension that never had any influx of immigrants at all. We don't have that, but the next best thing then is to try to find another chicken packing place. say that 10 times fast, and try to compare those two things. So here are the links if you're interested. I think all those links are hopefully still active. You can click on them. And it's an interesting documentary thing, and not least because it just really lays bare several really important things here. What they're doing is constructing a synthetic control. So they're looking within this, the commuting zone, which are delineated by these darker red lines. Marshall County is one of these. That also includes Jackson, DeKalb, and Eloa, maybe. I can't quite see how that's spelled, and I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but it's within a commuting zone. The Census Bureau does a lot of amazing data work here, and the point is to try to look at the places workers live and where they commute to and combine them all into something that seems like it ought to be a local labor market. Here's one of them. Here's another one, CZ 11,101, and presumably these are measured, I guess, across the nation or something with the number that high. Here's one down here. It's not the same, right? It's different. This looks like a river, probably. What happens to it here, I'm not entirely sure, but there's several rivers up here. These are different geographic places. But the point is to try to look at otherwise similar things and see what happened when different places were treated differently with these immigrant shocks. Now, if you're into this sort of thing, you might say, well, okay, but it's not as if this particular commuting zone was exogenously treated by some policy. It's not as if Donald Trump, who obviously can declare he has absolute power, so he can declare everything. It's not as if he just said, oh, well, let's go ahead and relocate a bunch of Mexican-American immigrants in this commuting zone. That never happened. Of course, this preceded his interest in politics, or roughly speaking, but none of that happened. So one of the problems with this is that still at the end of the day, it was not a Mariel boat lift where Fidel Castro said, okay, fine, here's my policy. A bunch of refugees can go to Florida. Boom, you're there. This was different. This was a story in which Mexican-American immigrants identified this area as a place that would work for them in their careers. So that's part of the challenge, and maybe it's part of why we're seeing what we see here ultimately. These graphs show the treatment group, so CZ 6100, which is the commuting zone that includes the small town we're talking about here. That's the dashed line. We're comparing the treatment, the dashed line, to a control group, which is what's called a synthetic control, or an average of several different otherwise similar places. Here we see that although there was an increasing foreign-born share over time, so we're talking about the share of population that's foreign-born, it was rising also in the control groups, but nowhere near as fast as it rose in the treatment group. The treatment group is the treatment group because it had this big increase in foreign-born, of course. In particular, then, focusing on the workers with less than a high school degree, one thing you could do, and it's the foreign-born share of the employed, so that's an additional benefit that you can look at in census data who actually is employed, and so that helps you a little bit understanding this is the labor force per se, not just the local population. And there too, we also see a really big increase in this particular commuting zone that really took off after 2000 in terms of the foreign-born share. So I mean, this is just staggering. We're talking about an increase that was like zero-ish among the less than high school, up to 70%. I mean, just a huge increase. And yet here, there is no effect on wages. Again, the dashed line is showing us the treatment group, and the solid line is showing us the control group. And there basically is no daylight here. Maybe a small reduction way out here. But I think this is all a proportional thing. And so we're talking about just a minuscule difference. Nothing at all like what this is showing on the previous slide. So you might wonder, well, okay, so suppose the wage isn't really flexible. There are reasons to think it might not be. So you might wonder about employment. And there are two things to say here in this graph. So again, previous graph, basically treading water with wages. I guess that's also useful to point out. So the weekly wage relative to 1990 basically was not showing any upward trend for either of these treatment or control groups. And you'd like for wages to increase. Wages staying stagnant is the sadness of the Malthusian model. Wages increasing is a more optimistic story about technological change. Here we see a more precipitous decline in employment, a slightly bigger increase, I guess, in CZ6100, but really not much there at all, just a big downward trend. The thing about this, this reveals no particular obvious treatment effect associated with immigration. But we should also take this more holistically and actually look at the trajectories here. We're also seeing a big hollowing out, it would appear, of employment. Now, part of this is, I think, probably driven by reductions in the number of people who have less than a high school degree. I think that's probably part of this, but still a pretty precipitous decline here, which is a story about reduced opportunity. So in a week or two, we'll talk about the opioid epidemic. The great professors Ann Case and Angus Deaton have an op-ed in today's New York Times all about that and the healthcare industry in the United States and the opioid epidemic. And their big focus is on non-Hispanic whites of low means, and that's exactly whom we are talking about here in these slides. These slides also reveal a lot of pain, a lot of economic pain, but the thing is that it's not pain that's differentially felt more by the commuting zones with lots of immigrants. It's pain that's felt broadly, it would appear, across these very similar commuting zones in Alabama. So there are two big things here. One is that there appears to be basically no effective immigration. And the second is that this to me, and here too, stagnation in wages, which is not unheard of, I think, in the United States, but of course, that we've become so inured to it, or so we are not even, if that's the right word, we're not even paying attention to this anymore. For college graduates, this is not what we see. We see increases in wages. That's part of the reason why you're here in C175, and I guess we shouldn't get too smug about it, should we? But it's the truth. It's these folks, less than a high school degree or with just a high school degree, who have really seen platitudes, I'm making up words as I go, obviously, who are seeing just flat trajectories of wages. And then here, a big reduction. And again, I think I would like to see the story about the population shares, because part of this story probably is the retirements of older birth cohorts who just don't have as much education. I think that's probably part of it too. So what do they conclude here? Well, it would appear there's just not much evidence of negative wage or employment effects of immigrants on natives. And a big question is why? Why do we not see that? So here, I think, given the time, about 9 minutes remaining, I'm just going to move ahead and leave all this text right here for you to read if you're so inclined. You can also click through and actually find the study if you're interested. Giovanni Perri is a very bright guy, and they wrote that extremely well in a very accessible fashion. You might wonder what's going on. The lab steps you through some of this, and in the Muriel Boatlift case, the data are a little bit less convincing than I think what we just saw, even though the experiment of the Muriel Boatlift is a more convincing natural experiment when Castro released a bunch of political detainees effectively. That's a more obvious natural experiment in which their relocation to Florida and the timing of it was solely dictated by an exogenous event, namely Castro deciding, okay, fine, just let them all go. Here, I think the problem with the Alabama study is there are obviously things that are drawing immigrants to live where they are. And they're probably doing it because they are aware of labor market conditions, and they don't want the labor market to crash for natives or for themselves. And I think that's something to keep in mind about this. But the other things that we can say about this include these. There might be a little effect because labor demand curves might be flat. That's possible. It's not real likely. You could view it as effectively having a long-term labor demand curve as being flatter, meaning that there's adjustment or evolution in the position of the labor demand curve over time for a variety of reasons here. New workers are also new demanders of local goods and services, shifting out labor demand in those other industries. Overall, then whether you would see an outward shift is a little less obvious, especially if you're talking about, say again, our example of chicken packers. Would you see an increased demand for chicken because immigrants have relocated into this area where chicken is produced? Yeah, you'd see some increase. But I think what we're getting at here is that you would also see increased demand for housing for those chicken workers. You'd see increased demand at the grocery store for other products that weren't chickens, complementary things that go with chickens, whether it's milk or sage or garlic. It's a great recipe, by the way. You should ask me about it. If you like chicken, I have a ton of chicken recipes. Capital adjusts, shifting out labor demand is another big one. And that's the big story in the solo model that we'll look at shortly. Another point is that labor markets are not necessarily highly localized. People can commute. So those who might be hurt might move away, or they might commute longer distances. They might also not be observed. So if you just look within the particular commuting zone, for example, that the study that we just looked at in about Alabama did, one of the challenges there, of course, is that if people decide they're going to start commuting outside of that commuting zone, there's a reason why it's called a commuting zone, but still people could do it. And if they did, then you might not be measuring really the full effect. So there is that open question, but I think there's great reason to think that this third bullet, capital adjusting, shifting out labor demand is probably a really big one. You could also view it as sort of a metaphor for what happens generally. You could call it capital adjusting. You could also call it the economy being elastic. Either one of those would be extremely good answers to an exam question about this. The economy adjusts. It's not the static labor demand curve picture that we saw. So here's just the illustration of what you might see. Sorry, I got a little bit mixed up there, but if you thought about a demand effect, something that shifted out the labor demand curve, this is what it might look like on the right-hand side of this slide, where without this outward shift of labor demand, you might see a very large decline in the wage from W to W prime here on the left. If you also see some outward shift of the local labor demand, you might see not as much of a reduction in the wage. And of course, measuring this in a survey, if the impact is not real large, it might be pretty easy to miss because of the way that we collect survey data. It's not usually on every worker within a particular area. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes left. Let me introduce this next model of two countries in the labor market, which I think is going to be a little confusing just with the setup of it. The point is to think about what the typical motivation is for immigrating. There's a labor market in a sending country where immigrants were before they moved, and there must be some motivation then for them actually to immigrate. Some immigrants, of course, are refugees, so they're fleeing political violence or other types of really bad things. But the majority of immigrants around the world and into the United States usually are economic immigrants. Obviously, even as I'm saying that, I can think of so many exceptions to all that, with the unrest in the Middle East leading to the great migration crisis of the last, say, 4 years or so, with the Syrian civil war, et cetera. So a lot of those things happen big time. In normal times, there are also a ton of economic immigrants. Just looking at the newspaper will reveal, this is true, and it also raises concerns and challenges, of course, when people are immigrants. Foreign-born Berkeley students, for example, are not really immigrants, technically speaking, but they are similar in that folks have traveled to UC Berkeley, and in many cases now have had to travel back because of the coronavirus. Similar challenges face many of the economic immigrants around the world who have relocated. Say, there's a story about African immigrants in China who are now facing a bunch of challenges there because of the coronavirus. So economic immigration all around the world for similar reasons. You're seeking higher wages in normal times, and the United States is a pretty good place to land because of the technology and the capital that generally makes workers more productive. So here now, just in the few minutes remaining, let me introduce this picture of gains and losses, both in receiving and also in sending countries. Since our model here is going to be that the rich country, you can think of it as the United States, here is depicted in the usual way with its wage along this axis and the amount of labor going to in the rightward direction or easterly out here from the origin. And then on the other side, we're going to imagine the total amount of labor that's allocated either in the poor or in the rich country, measured here from this origin moving this way, and we'll see how this works in a second. So the total amount of labor is uppercase L. Here's a amount of labor in the rich country, uppercase L R, and then an amount of labor in the poor country. So that's why we've got this sort of, I guess, goalpost, right? It's like a football, US football goalpost kind of thing, and then halfway or so wherever we are exactly, I guess, 1/4, 3/4 is the allocation of labor. It's a pretty good assumption to say that the reason the rich country is rich is because its labor demand curve is shifted out with higher technology and more capital. So the prevailing wage then, prior to any immigration happening, is higher in the rich country than it is in the poor country. So if you could, as somebody in the poor country, you would pick up and move. You would see the higher wage in the rich country and you'd move. So let's imagine this amount of migration moving from the poor country to the rich country, a reduction in the wage paid to unskilled labor in the rich country, and then actually on the flip side, an increase in the wage paid to unskilled labor in the poor sending country when this amount of migrants, M, picks up and goes to the rich country. So there are going to be winners and losers here, just like there are in the simple model that we started off with. I think I'll wait until next time to step through that and stop. It looks like we're out of time. I'm definitely happy to take questions if anybody has any. Oh, my favorite chicken recipe. I think it's milk sage chicken. I think if you Google for it, I think it's a Jamie Oliver thing. My wife found it. She's awesome. I think that's who came up with it. There's another variation. You can actually do milk sage and pork. Both very good. These days, of course, as any parent of young children will know, basically we do things in the slow cooker or the French oven. Why does WP only increase a little? That's a really good question. So WP is shown here only increasing a little because of gently sloped labor demand in the sending country. And I would have to think about, I mean, that's mechanically why. I think, what determines the slope of labor demand? So I would have to think about it, and it's not a takeaway point I was intending to put in your heads, but mechanically that's kind of what's going on here. WP doesn't jump to WR. Oh, well, okay, so what you mean by that, the question from Nicole is, does WP jump to WR? I think what you have in your head is an idea about what's an equilibrium here. And the answer is going to be that the crossing would be the equilibrium, because at that point, if enough labor reallocated so that in the sending country, there was this much labor from zero out to this point, and in the rich country, the receiving country, there was this much labor from zero out to this same point there, then the wages would be equalized. I think that's what you probably have in your head. And if there weren't any restrictions on immigration, that's where we plausibly would end up. Okay, why don't we call it a day. See you Thursday. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Oops, I think there was one last question there. Let me click back. So it is not in equilibrium now. That's correct. So the way I've depicted it, we're not actually in equilibrium. We've just allowed M immigrants from the sending country to show up in the receiving country. That's right. And that's realistic. And as we'll see in the Clemens reading, there are restrictions on immigration. We don't have open borders. Could we say that the labor demand curve for the rich country is steeper because the rich country is more capital intensive? Yeah, it's higher because it's more capital intensive. Whether it's steeper or not, I'm not quite sure. I'd have to look at maybe the Solow model math would help us. Help us think about this. I've just never thought about it. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Let's call it a day, and I'll see you Thursday.